The problems facing New Zealand's primary sector have been mounting at a rapid pace. So I think it's time for open hearts and open minds.
Welcome to Sarah's Country. Welcome to daylight saving, and for many parts of the country today, welcome to winter. Yes, that's right, to our Northern Hemisphere friends who love to tune into this live broadcast for your breakfast. Here in New Zealand, like I'm sure many parts of the world are experiencing, season extremes, and sometimes they're just not quite in the order we're used to. If you're new to the show, kia ora, I'm your host, Sarah Perriam, and if you're watching, welcome to my home. It was meant to be a temporary solution until we got fibre connected at our new studio. And we have, but it's really hard to let go of those comforts of home. For those who are listening and watching in those colder places, I've seen some amazing, my entire Instagram feed was a whiteout today in lots of parts around the South Island. And I'm sure overnight it's going to continue. Invercargill, snow on the ground, I've heard. Banks Peninsula, it's apparently tonight going to hit. I'd love to see in the comments below and hear about the snow around the country. Tell me how many inches or centimetres have you had around the country? And of course, what about those winds? We've done a pre-recorded interview. You'll hear it later, and I swear to God, you could hear the wind in the background of that interview. Here in Lincoln in Canterbury, it's been a day of four seasons, and certainly Mother Nature is telling us that there is another few days of it. For those lambing and calving, our thoughts are absolutely with you. So please take care out there. And of course, for those, as I said, listening and watching, I hope you've got that fire going, nice and crackling and keeping warm. Because you know what? The main thing that I love about this show is that it's about feeling welcome. And it's not just about welcome into this community we're creating around Sarah's Country, but it's also welcome to have the freedom to share ideas and also listen with an open heart and an open mind. You know what? I really feel that we don't do a lot of listening well. Yes, we do have a lot to defend. We have the way we've done things for a long time, and they have been done for the right reason. But at the same time, we have a consumer that is certainly changing their ideas and who is right at the end of the day. Sarah's Country is produced in alliance with the great family at Farmers Weekly, with your great in-depth journalism hitting your mailboxes today and tomorrow so that you are up to date on the matters that matter most to farming and growing food and fibre here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We talk a lot about the importance of family here on the show. And the reason is I'm lucky to have been born and raised in a village of wacky and wonderful humans that I call my family. And as we kick off week one of the school holidays, I think it's awesome to take a moment to really acknowledge that we're not actually all meant to be born equal. Because if we did, it'd be really boring. You know, we are actually a product of a generation before us, yes, and we are currently walking the wisdom of what we have experienced and passionate about what we actually feel connected to. And every single step, I believe, at different generations has had the ability to the information that they have currently had in their hands to make those decisions. And nobody should, of course, be held up against that. But in terms of product of the generation before me, I'm absolutely fortunate to have my wonderful and wacky mother here tonight, staying with me. She's sitting right over there and she's refusing. For those who know my mother, she will be refusing profusely to come on, but I tell you what, she has a thing or two to say about what's going on around the country at the moment, and rightly so. Can I tell you a conversation that she did actually say to me last night? And we ended up having this conversation about how far things have come with bureaucracy and governments, etc., etc. Talking about the term freehold, and really at the end of the day, is there really any free left in hold in terms of property rights and where things are going? But it's a very interesting debate and conversation to keep open-minded and keep having an open heart about as well. Who's right at the end of the day? The consumer or the person who works the land every single day. We will continue to have that conversation on here on Sarah's Country. And of course, tonight with our guests, after 7:20, the environmental and animal welfare record of New Zealand farmers is coming under closer scrutiny in trade talks. Beef and Lamb's Senior Trade Policy Manager Stephanie Honey is going to join us following a fantastic webinar I watched earlier this week with Vangali Vitalis, who's sharing that there is counter-negative perceptions about the environmental impact of New Zealand agriculture. What I read into this is that jealousy against our amazing environmental and animal welfare credentials is actually hindering our trade talks. It's a fantastic interview after 7:20. Now, selling bales of wool to the rest of the planet, we know is not going to improve farm gate returns. After 7:30, Tech and Colour New Zealand General Manager Richard Blomendal believes the problem lies in New Zealand's lack of ability to manufacture to a finished product. And to close the show, Minister of Agriculture Damien O'Connor joins us after Labour's pledge of $50 million. And this is towards a single farm plan, which will remove some of the regulatory burdens farmers will face. Yes, you heard that. To close the show, Damien will join us. But first up, if planting production forests is to be restricted with the idea of protecting farming, taxpayers are likely to have to pay billions of dollars for imported carbon credits. A earlier conversation I had with Forest Owners Association President Phil Taylor. I'd love to hear your comments below. All that coming up in Sarah's Country. This is Sarah's Country. Well, Forest Owners Association says taxpayers are likely to have to pay billions of dollars for imported carbon credits if planting production forest will be restricted with the idea of protecting farming. Now, the Forest Owners Association President Phil Taylor will join us shortly. He has talked about a quarter of the forest estates already being in these particular classes. This is classes 6 and 7 land. For those who are watching who are unfamiliar, this is extremely steep hill country. If foresters were allowed to plant on these harder non-arable land, then the understanding from the Forest Owners Association is that these imported credits would, of course, not protect farming at all. And joining us now is President Phil Taylor. Phil, can you give us a little bit of an understanding around where this opinion comes from in this restriction to planting production forests?
Yeah, good evening, Sarah, and good evening, viewers. Look, there have been a number of political parties leading up to the election who have responded to pressure coming from the farming sector to put controls on afforestation in New Zealand. And so that's basically raised some concerns amongst the forest industry. You know, our view is that forestry is an equally valid land use to farming on those classes 4 through 7.
Okay, so let's talk about these calculations that you've done in terms of paying billions of dollars for imported carbon credits. How will these be far more expensive than us reaching carbon neutrality by 2050 on our own bat?
Well, as you know, the New Zealand ETS and the New Zealand government's commitment to climate change is an extremely complicated issue. But basically, the New Zealand government has 3 options if it's going to meet its 20 to 50 goals. One of the options is to pull out of their commitment to climate change globally, and clearly that's not going to be palatable. The second option is to plant trees, which is our preferred option, and the third option is that the government will have to go out onto the international market, or will most likely have to go out onto the international market and purchase carbon credits internationally.
Okay, what about the argument of reducing rather than offsetting?
Yeah, I mean, long term, forests are not the solution. If New Zealand is truly committed to meeting its climate change objectives, it will need to find more permanent ways of reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. And those are both from carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide.
And what about in terms of highly erodible land? How are we going to actually ensure that there is environmental protection around this? I mean, you talk about it being, class 6 and class 7 land, but a lot of this is actually highly productive beef and sheep properties as well. And for a lot of young people being able to have that opportunity to get into farming. Do you believe that we should just cover anything that's too steep to farm when we do have a track record for many decades on being able to achieve so?
Look, there's been a lot of debate around the role of permanent carbon forestry versus traditional production forestry combined with carbon farming. And forest owners' view is that there certainly is a place for permanent carbon forestry on those more highly erodible and remote areas of class 7 and 8 land. We don't subscribe to the fact that all land in classes 4 to 6 should be reserved for farming. Forestry is an equally valid land use, and the recent report by PwC demonstrated, in fact, that in terms of the economic return per 1,000 hectares and the jobs created, forestry far exceeds farming.
It's an interesting one to be able to convince, and I think it's an interesting one in terms of going into the election as well. Phil, how do you feel that forest owners' future is around going into the future without New Zealand First there alongside you, with the Billion Trees program being a very big part of seeing this plantation spread across the country?
Well, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge on behalf of forest owners all the good work that Minister Jones has done. He's probably been the best advocate for forestry in the last 30 years. But putting that aside, we believe that eventually the reality will dawn that if New Zealand is committed to its climate change objectives, it is going to have to plant more trees. There's no if or buts. And as I mentioned earlier, the other alternatives are to purchase credits internationally and see all those funds go overseas, or to abandon part of, if not most of, New Zealand's climate change ambitions.
What about the idea, when I had a yarn to James Shaw the other day, that he is looking at native trees coming into this, and he is looking at riparian planting? Is this particular message coming from forest owners, that last grasp in terms of that pines are the be-all and end-all in terms of achieving, and that you're not acknowledging that there is other ways of sequestering carbon?
Look, we have never acknowledged that there's only planting trees as being the only way to sequester carbon. The reality is our climate change goals are so ambitious that we're going to have to use every tool in the toolbox to take advantage of forestry, whether it's indigenous planting, whether it's native planting, whether it's exotic planting, whether it's in plantation forests, or whether it's in riparian strips. We need every tool available. And, look, Sarah, the irony of me is not lost that later tonight, I understand that you're interviewing Minister O'Connor, and he's talking about applying 50 million New Zealand dollars to basically assist farmers in reducing regulatory burdens. This is somewhat ironic that at the same time we're hearing governments talking about imposing more regulation on forestry, which really is one of the silver bullets, at least in the short term, for New Zealand's climate change ambitions.
And when you say about the increase in regulation, in terms of the safety record around forestry and in terms of the environmental degradation and management of forestry, would you argue that forestry does still have some work to do?
Yes, of course it does. But I think in terms of health and safety, we should reflect on the amazing progress that the forest industry has made over the last 7 years. In fact, now forestry is significantly lower in terms of its health and safety record compared to agriculture, construction, and other high-risk industries. In terms of environmental performance, I'd be the first to acknowledge that Tolaga Bay has been our Achilles heel, but the forest industry has stepped up to that. It's taking responsibility for that. And in most other areas around environmental performance, forestry is second to none in terms of the land use.
And lastly, for those who have the argument that forestry is sequestering carbon for X amount of period of time yet to be cut down and that carbon to then be eroded back into the environment, is this really just a lock-up for the short-term policy for the long-term problem that we have?
Yeah, as the Forest Owners Association will be first to acknowledge, and I've made it previously in our interview tonight, that forestry is a long-term solution to New Zealand's climate change issues. There have to be other ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And agriculture has a very important part to play in this, given that it makes up 48% of New Zealand's emissions. So I think the part of the problem is the debate has become incredibly polarised, and we're getting the pro-forestry, the pro-farming. What we need to do to make progress is to actually engage collectively and actually work out solutions that can help New Zealand farmers, New Zealand foresters, and New Zealand Incorporated basically address its climate change challenges.
What I'm hearing from you, Phil, is that it's not an and or. We're all in this together, and it's about time we actually start to understand how this can happen. But you can understand the threats on both sides to have that open-minded conversation that needs to happen. To me, forestry, and the way you describe it, is like a sponge mopping up a wet floor that eventually needs to be wrung out.
I think that's probably quite a good metaphor, Sarah.
So therefore, in terms of a short-term solution, it's there. And of course, we need to wrap around an industry. Lastly, Phil, before you go, the processing of our wood here on our shores, does that concern you that we do not have the infrastructure to add value here if we are going to utilise this as a sponge for our carbon problem?
Yeah, I mean, the forest owners would all dearly love to see more domestic processing in New Zealand. And the New Zealand Coalition Government's announcement recently to favour wood over concrete and steel is a long way towards doing that. There's no point in propping up domestic processing simply to prop it up. The best way to do this is to stimulate demand. And again, we would like to applaud the New Zealand government in this area. We think they've got it wrong in the carbon space, but in terms of domestic wood processing and encouraging more processing onshore, we think they've got it right.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. It's President for the Forest Owners Association, Phil Taylor. I'd love to hear your thoughts from Phil in the comments wherever you are watching live. Coming up after the break, we're going to be joined by Stephanie Honey. She is the Senior Trade Policy Manager for Beef and Lamb New Zealand. And this is following a recent webinar with the Director of Foreign Trade, Vingali Vitalis. A very interesting front page story on this week's Farmers Weekly by Nigel Sterling about how our environmental footprint and all the work that we are doing actually is having an effect still on our access to trade, but also too around how we can maximise that story in a world that is about the rising of protectionism. All that after the break on Sarah's Country. This is Sarah's Country.
Delicious. Ever wondered where it starts? Does it start with care? Respect. Fresh grass, 365 days a year. The truth is, delicious doesn't start in a single moment or with a single ingredient. Delicious starts here.
Well, front page of Farmers Weekly this week, thanks to Nigel Sterling, is a story about trade negotiations and how the environmental and animal welfare record of New Zealand farmers is coming under closer scrutiny in our trade talks as countries search for new ways to maintain protections for their own food producers. New Zealand's top trade negotiator, Vingali Vitalis, has warned sheep and beef farmers in a recent online online seminar that the pandemic had accelerated a resurgence in protectionism in agricultural trade and that there was more still to come. Billions of dollars in subsidies are being shoveled into the pockets of farmers in the world's major economies to protect them from the fallout of trade wars and, of course, that hit to demand from coronavirus. Joining us now is Senior Trade Policy Manager, my apologies, Stephanie Honey from Beef and Lamb. Stephanie, welcome to Sarah's Country.
Kia ora, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
It was a fantastic webinar that you held recently, and of course, front page, there is that warning from our trade negotiators that this is about market access now. This isn't about a premium. Can you set the scene on some of those key messages that Vingali touched on?
Certainly, Sarah. Yes, it's a very turbulent time in trade, unfortunately, and it regrettably does actually predate COVID-19 as well. So for the last few years, we've seen rising protectionism around the world, including in some of our key markets. And, one of the big challenges for New Zealand exporters and for, of course, the trade officials is to do what we can to counter that rising protectionism. That said, we're very fortunate to have somebody like Vangelis Vitalis in the seat there. He does a great job for New Zealand, and so do the Minister of Trade and Economic Development, David Parker, but it's a big challenge for us as a sector to counter those protectionist impulses. And of course, since COVID-19, there's been even more pressure on that market access issue, as you mentioned.
I want to jump straight to the deals going on between the EU and South America and how that is having untoward effect on New Zealand.
Well, if you've followed the media in the last little while, you would probably have seen protests and so on around Europe about this new trade deal that the European Union and Mercosur, so those countries in Latin America, have struck. And a lot of the concern from European consumers in particular has been around the impact of that trade deal. Essentially, the new market access that the Europeans have granted to those Latin American countries might provoke more production of beef and other products in those countries. And the concern there is that, or the fear is that it might prompt more deforestation in the Amazon, for example. So, removing the trees in order to produce more beef to supply into Europe.
Now, of course, anything with consumers and movements are all about that simple, actionable messaging. And is New Zealand able to cut through and say, we don't cut down our native forest to produce beef?
Yes, I mean, we're both smiling. It seems like such a ridiculous idea that we would do that. New Zealand, I'm very proud to say, has a great record here and is very proactive, both at the level of the negotiators, but also, of course, our wonderful farming community. So, I think our approach has been driven not just because it's the right thing to do to safeguard the environment, but also because obviously we're very responsive to what our consumers and our customers want. And we're hearing all around the world, not just in Europe, that those are concerns that customers really put a high weight on. So, of course, over the years, the sector itself has done, incredibly well to address those sustainability concerns. I think farmers have reduced greenhouse gas emissions by about 30%, all the while maintaining production levels at about the same sort of level. And, we can credit that to a very deliberate attempt to improve productivity, to improve the systems and the way that we do things. We produce more from less and in a more environmentally sustainable way. So that's one of the key messages that we're trying to deliver to the Europeans, that we hear what consumers want, we know what's the right thing to do, and we're actively seeking to do that.
Stephanie, before you go, you spoke there about Minister David Parker and his involvements with trade negotiations. How closely aligned, apart from the fact that he has two distinct policies, the environment and trade, is what he's hearing overseas affecting domestic policy here at home? And do you believe as a sector we understand yet depth of demand from our consumers internationally?
Well, Sarah, that's a great question. And I think, I look at it through a trade lens. It's a win-win. The kind of products that we produce responding to consumers are also systems and approaches that are environmentally friendly and sustainable. We produce to the market, and we produce in a way that's unsubsidised, that seeks to enhance, sustainable production, and that delivers the value back to our processing companies, to our exporters, but of course also to farmers and farming communities. So it's a win-win, really. And, I think beef and lamb, and we work very closely with the Meat Industry Association, are very actively engaged with our trading partners to tell that story, that very positive story about our values and our production systems. Of course, the sector is very closely involved with He Waka Eke Noa, with the government and with Māori, to, basically prioritise those environmental concerns in our production systems. And, that's a win for our exports as well.
Thank you so much, Senior Trade Policy Manager Stephanie Honey there, following the Beef and Lamb New Zealand webinar recently with the Director of Foreign Trade, Vingali Vitalis, a very intelligent man representing New Zealand on a global stage. Now, it's interesting, I just want to touch on that. I was having a discussion with a friend of mine, and she is living in an urban area, and she said to me, I would buy milk at a premium if it said on its label that there was no bobby calves in this process. How can I find this? This is something I believe in, but it's not something I can see or differentiate. So as much as a lot of these different demands are coming from a consumer, we may already be doing them, but how are we going to be able to differentiate that from these global examples, such as cutting down the Amazon? Coming up after the break on Sarah's Country, and a story by Annette Scott in this week's Farmers Weekly, we're going to be joined by Richard Blomendal. He's a general manager for Tech and Colour, and he has a thing to say about how hard it will be to fix the wool industry. This is Sarah's Country.
Balance has its own team of innovation specialists. It's our job to lead the way, working with some of the most cutting-edge science and research. We've got partnerships with some of the best suppliers in the world, so our farmers get the very best products for New Zealand farms.
And in every region across the country, the conditions are very different, and farmers and growers' needs are too.
That's why we're always looking for solutions that are just right, like here at our Huntly Service Centre.
And here in Canterbury, we've got a self-service silo, so I can pick up fat when it suits me.
And here in Morrinsville, we've got a world-class mill. That means that we can safely deliver our customers with the freshest, highest quality feed and minerals.
It's about putting the customer first, because that's what drives our business.
We've been focusing on faster turnaround of orders. We've got to get the right products to the right places at the right times.
Here in Taranaki, we've got New Zealand's only urea manufacturing plant. It's where we create our premium sustained fertiliser.
We're supplying nationwide and working locally. By getting to know you and what you want to achieve, we can help you get there.
And with the new My Balance platform, Balance has put my farm at my fingertips.
In fact, we offer support in all sorts of ways, sharing the best nutrition practice with farming families across the country. Whether we're talking about animal health, farm productivity,
or looking after our natural environment, sustainability underpins everything we do. We use our local expertise and the latest tools to help farmers and growers navigate the changing regulations, so you can leave your farm in great shape for the future.
And we can be really accurate, avoiding areas like wetlands and waterways with our award-winning Spread Smart tech. It makes the job far safer, more efficient, and gives you the best results.
When you've got access to that kind of know-how, you've got the support you need to make sure you're farming sustainably. It's that kind of thinking that'll keep us going for generations to come.
Together creating the best soil and feed on earth.
Well, welcome back to Sarah's Country. For those who have been following along and listening from the start, and for those who have just joined us, of course, it is daylight savings as of overnight on Saturday night. And isn't it wonderful to have that extra light? I don't know about you, but I was a little bit thrown this morning in terms of the old alarm clock and how my body clock was feeling with that change. And also, what about the change in weather? Holy moly, it's an absolute whiteout in parts of New Zealand. I absolutely extend my love and care for all of those that are experiencing it. But what a special way to start the school holidays with a few snowmen and snow fights and bits and pieces. But it's not a laughing matter when it comes to lambing. And of course, if you're reading this week's Farmers Weekly, the lamb crop around New Zealand does not need an extra hit. And I'm absolutely loving having you along with me live here in the comments below. Phil Taylor certainly wound you up, and I've got some comments here around. Guy Peacock has simply said soil carbon. Not quite sure exactly what you're meaning there, Guy. I'm trying to track down a fantastic interview for later in the week around soil carbon from a professor from Waikato University following his pulpit opinion piece in Farmers Weekly. Bronwyn Williamson, forestry is degradation of New Zealand, absorbs groundwater, sours the soil, disintegrates forest floors to toxic mess. Natives should be replaced with natives. And Michael Ross said, in evaluating the long-term value of forestry to the whole economy, we also need to factor in the costs of commercial forestry. For instance, the health impact of pollen and the cost to farmers of forestry's non-performance in meeting their obligation under the Biosecurity Act. This is in regards to pest management, and this is something Michael brought to our attention quite some weeks ago, and I really want to follow closely, especially with Osprey's obligations under the Biosecurity Act to ensure that all neighbours of all farmland are ensuring good pest management. But Michael, whilst we're in the break, I was talking to my offsider here. She won't come on camera. This is my mother, Bronwyn, and this is about the health impact of pollen. And sorry, I'll just come to our next guest in just a moment. Dan, thank you so much. Now, just talking to my offsider here, my mum, who's joining me tonight, she's staying. She won't come on camera, but she's saying about the sterile nature. Yeah, so therefore pines are cloned and therefore sterile in terms of pollen. When it comes to wilding pines, there's pollen. Yeah, absolutely. So let me tell you what, she's sitting here with all of this wonderful knowledge. She won't come on and share it, but she's certainly definitely a good sideline. It's like backseat drivers. Yeah, it's like having your mother sitting over there. Anyway, carrying on to our next guest. You know how much I love talking about wool. And there is an article in Farmers Weekly that I definitely suggest that you should read by Annette Scott with our next guest. He says selling bales of wool to the rest of the planet is not going to improve farm gate returns. Tech and Colour New Zealand General Manager Richard Blomendal believes the problem lies in New Zealand's lack of ability to manufacture a finished product. I 100% agree with him. Despite a group being established, he says recently, and this is the Strong Wool Action Group, recently appointing Andy Cowie of the Armadillo Merino brand as its chief executive, one organisation cannot take charge of an almost zero manufacturing infrastructure here in this country to turn this rural material around. And Richard joins us now. Good evening, Richard. Thank you so much for your wisdom. And you are so correct. How did we get to a point of zero manufacturing of wool products in 2020?
I think it stems back, thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. I think it stems back historically to the late 60s and 70s, where we had a thriving textile manufacturing industry. We're making worsted and woolen products, finished products, fine suits, the likes of Swan Dry, other brands made by companies like Lane Walker Rudkin, Auckland Knitting Mills, and lots of iconic brands were around. And then we had the removal of tariffs, governments, various organisations and boards, and decided that, hey, let's import synthetic textiles and finished products made from around the world, and let's remove all the tariffs and take the protection away from the New Zealand manufacturing industry. And the net result is we find ourselves essentially where we are today.
It is an interesting thing. We have had a rise in globalisation, and as we heard there from Stephanie Honey, we have this return back to protectionism at a national level, and decimated industries in the process of that. And could you give us an understanding of how Technicolor has been through that in terms of wool infrastructure and manufacturing here in this country?
For sure. Technicolor was formed in 2003 as a result of a merger between an Australasian supplier. So we're a trans-Tasman business, and we were supplying technical products, or we still are, technical products to the textile and leather industries. Over that time, we've just seen the slow demise of these manufacturing organisations, these textile manufacturing organisations, to the point now where we have two significant wool carpet manufacturers in Cavalier Bremworth and Godfrey Hirst. We have another one, a non-vertical manufacturer in New Zealand Yarn. And then we also have, conversely, the leather industry as well, who are struggling to make. There's only one company now making finished products, and that's Tasman Tanning. That's finished leather to the market. The others are all making wet blue product or salted and shipping it offshore. So it's just so frustrating to see that we're meat and dairy, and then we have these co-products that we should also be making finished value-added products. It's just, because I'm so passionate about the wool industry, it's so frustrating to see that happen.
And Richard, they didn't used to be co-products. They used to be the product, didn't they, in terms of wool and strong wool in this country, especially in the 1950s. I love the comment here that you said, and this is in the Farmers Weekly article and by Annette Scott in this week's Farmers Weekly, is rightly or wrongly the consumer within our largest trade partner, Asia, are not concerned with sustainability, farming emissions or climate change. Yet we do have such a strong reliance on China, and this is where a lot of our synthetic products are flooding our markets.
Absolutely right. I mean, you've got another manufacturer, like the likes of the carpet mill, and rightly so. They import synthetic yarn, and they've taken advantage of a market that was crying out for something, and they took advantage of the market overtaking the wool products, and look, all power to them, but it's been at the detriment of the New Zealand wool industry, and I think that comes down to the government protection that needs to be in place of that industry for our co-products, both textiles and leather. Cavalier Bremworth have recently made the statement that they're going 100% wool. I think they see the advantages of that, the climate change mantras, the sustainability, the younger people, the younger generation now seeing and demanding that there's a sustainability profile and a connection to climate change and recycling. And there's all these synthetic, the synthetic argument with going into waterways now and being able to recycle things. You know, the wool has a definite advantage in that space.
Yeah, but Richard, the key element to your argument in this article, I understand, is that we lack the integration and the infrastructure from a primary through our supply chain, because that entire secondary market has been ripped out, the manufacturing. And so therefore we have these amazing wool branded stories, yet the wool sourced here, primary, yet as a brand to a consumer, it has been produced overseas. And so we're completely lacking that value chain and retaining it here. But our government refuses to invest in capital infrastructure because that would be seen as a subsidy and is not in the business of that. What would you say how this government could support you and the wider wool infrastructure?
That's a really interesting question and a difficult one to answer. I think if the companies like Cavalier Bremworth, Godfrey Hirst can tap in and do their thing with marketing wool and education of the consumer, the government, because the government has specifically said it's now up to industry, the wool industry, to make it happen. I'm not sure that's the correct angle on this because of the primary industry connection. But I think if entrepreneurs and people like ourselves, I mean, we're here to support those people. If they can tap in and convince the government that this is the right way to go, support New Zealand textile industry, support the wool industry, leather, I can't see how, if they're supporting our primary industries, how they can not protect it or support it financially in some way. I just don't get it. I just don't get it.
Richard, do you believe that we are looking for too much top-down leadership and we actually need to take some ownership from a ground level?
Yes, I firmly believe that. Yeah, I think we do. Yeah.
Because the government actually isn't a businessman. They don't actually understand market demand and forces at play, etc. They're in the business of taking money and dishing it back out the other side, really. And so therefore, what I really would love to know is there is so many parts of the wool industry that I talk to that are similar to you in the manufacturing and the secondary industry around this, frustrated, absolutely frustrated. I'd love to know, in your personal opinion, this Strong Wool Action Group, is this the be-all and end-all, and have you had conversations that you've actually walked away going, we've got this?
I haven't had any conversations with the Strong Wool Action Group. Suffice to say, I know a number of people on that in that action group who I have had conversations with is people like Brian Richard's partners. He's branding and strategy. Craig Smith, Tom Sullivan, and there were conversations between a whole bunch of people in that space going on for a number of weeks ago now, and rightly or wrongly, those people feel a little bit blindsided. I'm not sure if that's the correct term, but it just seems this Strong Wool Action Group has been formed just not really in conjunction with the wool, those wool interests. And there's a whole lot of wool interested people and organisations around that all want to see New Zealand succeed in this space. And right now it's really, really disjointed. How we bring all that together now, I mean, I think the noises are being made and strong noises are being made. And I just think we need to get it together. One organisation isn't going to do it, and then the dictation of that isn't going to make it happen. The farmers, the growers, and we've been saying this for years, the growers need to be connected to the manufacturers and connected to the end consumer. That's how we do that, how we get the growers connected to the likes of Cavalier Bremworth and Godfrey Hirst and New Zealand Yarn and CP Wool, how we get all that connection. That's That's the bit that needs to happen.
Richard, can I ask you for the better feedback there. Can I ask you to close, how do you, in your role as the middle manufacturing, actually add value when there is no investment to quality of the fibre from the shed floor in terms of respect for the product that they're producing and the disinvestment for so many years into that quality handling of that wool to deliver it to you to do something amazing with it?
Well, we don't. What we're a supplier and a supplier of technical resource and skills and knowledge, along with processing product. So we help these companies value add. We help value add to that product, but we're supplying products to create the finished product. We're not supplying products in the wool industry specifically to ship it offshore. Yeah.
My point there is that if you do not have the investment from the farmer and being able to move away from a commodity mindset of being incentivised on a per kilo basis, then how do we actually move towards something that is of more value in terms of a supply chain integration that you've suggested?
I suggested to Craig and Tom that perhaps farmers need to be investing in manufacturing and to other people. That way they get the return from the wool, but they're also invested in the manufacturing of the product. And there are some companies around, like you heard of probably Just Shorn, that are trying to do that. How big that scale is, I'm not sure. But the farmers need to be intimately connected to the manufacturers. And that's been a large problem in New Zealand, where the farmers or the growers, they want their dollar per kilo or whatever it is across the farm gate. But they haven't been, I don't know whether it's I don't care how I get my money so long as I get it. But they need to be connected somehow or invested in the manufacturing. And there's been a lot of boards and organisation over a number of years that have tried to get that to happen, but it's kind of never happened. And I don't know how we get the farmers invested in that, because there's been various levies and organisations where farmers have had to contribute money, hoping that these organisations will be able to get the returns for their wool that they've been promised. And like wool equities fell over. I mean, there's various, the meat and wool board. I mean, all these things have over the years have fallen over. We need one that doesn't fall over.
Yes, Richard, you're absolutely right. It's kind of like a gambler who really, really wants a win, because that's what it's felt like for so blimmin' long in the wool industry. And farmers have burnt fingers. And how do we continue to provide hope that is there? Thank you so much for your insight, Richard Blomendal from Tech and Colour New Zealand, and Annette Scott focuses on the thoughts of Richard there in this week's Farmers Weekly. I'd love to know your thoughts following that, as well as of course, your thoughts on any of the stories that we do have, which we put on podcast on demand first thing in the morning. If you've started following along with Sarah's Country, you can listen to the individual podcasts, download them to take them with you on the go wherever you are around this beautiful country, or for our international listeners, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you. Coming up to close, we're going to be joined by Minister of Agriculture Damien O'Connor, as $50 million has been pledged in an election promise to bring together all of the regulation and bureaucracy, and this is the Labour government, the Labour Party suggesting this, to create one farm plan. All that coming up to close in Sarah's Country. This is Sarah's Country.
Really pleased we got into this. Thanks for your help, Dave.
It's a good idea, honey. You reckon it'll come out? Cover it and tell compound to leave it 10 minutes, and you'll be fine. Good call, Dave.
Good call on getting those security cameras, Dave.
You caught a new one yet?
Yeah, kind of.
When you've got decisions to make, we'll be there to help you make the right call.
I'd go for those ones, Bob. Yeah, good call.
Did you choose these?
Oh, you know.
For great advice and insurance, talk to FMG.
Well, there's two things farmers hate, duplication and bureaucracy. And the Labour Party is straight out the block when it comes to its agricultural policy, pledging $50 million to help farmers pay for comprehensive farm plans. This will be a single framework to take on board all of the different box-ticking exercises that farmers now have to undergo. Damien O'Connor, Minister of Agriculture, will join us shortly to talk about how this will reduce the burden of compliance and help our agri-sector create greater economic returns for their products. The initial investment would help fund plans that meet all on-farm requirements for growers and farmers, environmental management, labour, biosecurity, health and safety, and replace that overlapping and wide-ranging reporting, auditing and consents. And Damien joins us now. Good evening, Damien. Now, of course, there has been a lot of different policy announcements, and will this firstly be the only one that is coming out pre-election on agriculture, or have we got more to come?
Look, this is the main one, I guess. We are committed to carry on doing what we're doing. That's the implementation of Fit for a Better World, working through encouraging more young people into agriculture and horticulture with the programs that we've got running now. So this one is at the heart of, I guess, assistance for farmers to meet the growing areas of compliance. And I hear the stories. I met with farmers just today who said, look, they have 3 plans or 3 people coming up the driveway with requirements for their operation. And what we're trying to do with the assistance of the $50 million is to bring it all into an integrated farm plan. I've had MPI officials working for almost a couple of years now on how to best identify the core components of this. Fonterra has planned, Synlait has a plan, Alliance, a number of them, some councils have plans to try and bring those core components into a template or a framework that says, look, if you work through this process and you can, it's not just about ticking boxes, but it is about having a plan for your particular bit of land, the operation that you run on it, and meeting all the requirements in a world that does look at us every single day very, very closely.
We look at the farm insurance program and the commercial advantages that these individual plans were, we've got the Sustainable Roundtable now that is actually adopting them finally. Will this be a minimum standard for access, do you think?
Look, I think it will. We undertake trade negotiations, EU, UK. They're always looking for excuses to keep us out of their markets. And as we've seen with requirements around beef access, around dairy into the US, we've had to meet arguably the highest standards in the world because they fear our efficiency, I guess. They fear the quality of our products. And their local producers, want, as I say, an excuse to keep us out. Look, we've met all of those through the years, and I think we can arguably say we probably meet the highest standards of any food exporting country around the world. We have to maintain that. There are new ways of them scrutinising our operations, not just social media, but the ability to measure residue levels in fruit and all of our products means that we have to ensure we don't have any of those residues slipping in. So making sure that we can meet the ever-increasing scrutiny means that the assurance programs we put in place have to be robust, they have to be auditable, and if they meet the requirements of the regional council, our animal welfare requirements, as well as the assurance quality for maybe a processing company, then that's the efficiency we need to gain.
Okay, you talk about auditable. Who will be seeing this out? Our councils are heavily overworked. Freshwater is just one more layer on top of their regional planning, and then of course this. Is it time to outsource this to a private entity potentially?
Look, we've been talking with the Institute of Primary Sector Advisors, effectively, and trying to work through, firstly, to assist them with meeting the requirements of a certified farm plan auditor, and that's working through e waka kanoa, so there'll be requirements over time for emissions. We do have now companies that do the auditing, or they've gone through the farm plans. If they haven't put in place an auditing system, be it to Alliance or Silver Fern Farms, that puts their whole story at risk. So we're working through the planning and then the confirmation and auditing of that. If we can have one person come onto farm and do all of that and cover the company requirements, cover the regional council, cover OSH, cover all of those things, then that will save us all. So getting those skilled people will be building on, I guess, the skills of farm advisors and others around the place. And, we're working with industry how to do that best.
Yeah, they become the farmer's best friend after, of course, their dog, Damien, being all that to one. And, of course, the capability shortages, as you've just explained, and the time lag in being able to train people up for this. How do you believe, sorry, that was a comment, but in terms of the last question, farmers will be sitting here going, what about all the plans I've already had to put in place, the resource consent I've already got? How will this be merged, or will they be already carried over?
Yeah, and exactly. That's what we want to do, is to merge those, because a lot of the requirements they've had to meet, it might be for resource consent, and it might be for, as I say, an assurance to get their product into a market that one of the companies might be selling into, Sinlay, Miraka. They've all got their own plans along with Fonterra. We want to merge those and make sure that you can go through this exercise once. It will be skilled people, but I know there'll be many up to the challenge. We don't want to just put in place in regional councils, for example, people who are agricultural experts, coming onto farms. But there will be farm advisors who maybe want to upskill in the areas of resource management and areas of water quality, and just for the markers. The technical issues obviously will have to be covered by, and I think there'll be monitoring, there'll be overseer. There's a number of tools that we have available to us now that some people are using, and we just have to put them in one toolbox and enable, hopefully one person or an auditor to scrutinise that once.
Okay, do you have a deadline around this, and how do you get to $50 million?
Look, we've got basically for the freshwater regulations, we've got just over 12 months to work through that before farmers might start getting consents. I've always said that, look, the consents are kind of a bottom line, and if people can put in place farm plans, then they can be accepted as a consent. The mitigating factors of what might be some risky areas of intensive winter grazing, if they're incorporated into a farm plan and you say, well, we're going to crop here, we're going to feed it out in this way, and if there's a bad weather event, we've got mitigating things in place. So all of those things will be in a farm plan, and if they're accepted instead of consent, then that's great. That moves us on quickly. So we won't have finished this, within a year or two, but we're on a pathway, I guess, to get to a point before 2025 when we'll have to be measuring our emissions as well, and as well as having good water standards in place.
Is this effectively a licence to operate?
I guess it is, really. We have a growing set of compliances. You have, unless you run a good regime around health and safety, you effectively don't have a licence to operate. Unless you meet minimum standards around animal welfare, you don't really have a licence to sell your animals, or we won't as a country. And so, ensuring that you meet this minimum standards around water quality, in different regions, in different ways, we understand that, then effectively, yes, it will be difficult to operate. It's not about social licence only, although that's really important. The social licence comes from assuring people that what we do in farming is good for the community, it's good for the land, good for the animals, and it'll be really good for our customers. And when we put this package together, I think we'll get a premium in the marketplace that helps us get more for our product, and helps us, work to a place of better prosperity, more profit, not just more production.
Thank you so much, Minister of Agriculture, Damien O'Connor. And people say to me, why don't you just record a podcast? No, this live stream and having your comments below is why I do what I do. Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday from 7 p.m. Absolutely brilliant having you alongside us. And of course, those listening on demand, you can participate in this conversation. Email me, sarah@sarahscountry.com at any time. Of course, on social media, wherever you follow us, please do send me messages. I do read every single one of them, and I absolutely love hearing from them. In particular, the comment I just got for a couple of comments actually following Damien O'Connor's interview, please keep sending them in. Kate Scott, how do we go about ensuring that these plans become a useful farm tool that adds value rather than a box ticking exercise to demonstrate compliance? Duncan Barr said, no, it is a social licence to operate. And Michael Ross said, time to look at how the UK deals with this. Start with Red Tractor. Michael, the way the UK deals with things, do we really want to aspire to having every Joe blog walking through mismothering lambs? Anyway, Kate, back to you. You in your profession, you know a huge amount around implementation that is not being taken into consideration. The thing is, we are in an election period, and you can pledge all the money you like, and you can use words like, we don't want to be over-prescriptive with the detail of how this will be spent. Welcome to the next couple of weeks of our life here in New Zealand, leading into the 2020 election. And on that note, today I thought it would be a really fun idea to start an election special next Wednesday evening, where you're going to hear from all of the parties, 7 parties. There's a few more, but 7 major parties, their agricultural policies. I would love you to be involved in how we craft these questions. This is how I want to do it. We're not going to have a debate, Judith versus Jacinda. What I'd like to do is individually ask them a question to 5 major key issues, and let's hear their response and create a panel discussion around it live. Please email me, sarah@sarahscountry. I'd like to know, what are those 5 key issues that we are going to frame this conversation around? What are these things that these 7 election promises you want to hear from all of these major parties? Please be involved. Sarah's Country is an open-minded, crowd-sourced show just for you on the matters that matter most to farming and growing food and fibre here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm your host, Sarah Perriam, and it's been an absolute privilege and pleasure to be with you on your Monday evening, or wherever you are listening to us on demand. I'm going to head off and hang out with my mum. Of course, it's not often she comes to stay, and it's been fantastic, so let's do it all again tomorrow at 7 o'clock. Across all the major platforms. In the meantime, take care of yourself out there in that cold, wherever you are across the South Island. Stay safe, look after your family, have a fantastic first day of the school holidays, and in the meantime, good night and go well. This is Sarah's